Alright everyone, now it's time for the Occult video number 330, and probably the last Occult video for the year, by the way. You know, it's Halloween, it's a good time to end that, looking forward to next year with enormous amounts of occult and literary work. I just wanted to inform people of something that's relatively important, and it's based on years of historical, sociological, anthropological, and spiritual study, which is most of the world's leaders, the significant ones. I'm not talking about, whoever runs Rwanda or something. I'm talking about the main world leader, the people that go to G20 and stuff like that. Most of them are corrupted pseudo-occultists, and I'll have to explain what this means. First, in a historical context. In a historical context, the political fabric of what became the world government, or governments that are sort of interconnected, that globalized system was initially an occult concept. You hear about this before the League of Nations concept in the political sense is really a thing. Already in the 19th century, in the wake not long after the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we're talking the 1870s and 80s, when a lot of people that were in the interwar period doing the pre-globalist diplomacy thing were little kids or barely in school or something, most of them. It was already being spoken of by occult groups, theosophists and similar groups, mystics in general, spiritualists, because there were kinds of spiritual knowledge being gleaned and opinions being made. They were affected by and then affected politics. In the case of theosophy, Besant initially was a socialist. There are trappings of pseudo-socialism embedded in some theosophical doctrines, although she seems to have by and large left them behind. And the collectivism is really, it's more like Jesus collectivism, like, hey, we should have our own communities. Not really a commune. Everyone's expected to actually work, which communists are very reluctant to do. But communal living in the sense of providing the basic necessities of things, education and shit. Anyway, here's what happened. The initial design of the occult in the era, especially the interwar era, Volkish movements, social reform movements all over the world, really, including in Asia, Meiji Restoration sort of shit going on as a technically spiritual element to it with regards to how you treat the emperor, the god emperor literally at the time, which is why he wasn't deposed when the U.S. won against Japan in World War II. That would have been a little bit of a problem, I think, politically and socially, which is why they didn't bother to. What happened is that these initial spiritual meanderings, what they were aimed towards doing was to progress mankind. A large part of that progression needed to be individual. You're sending forth a doctrine, you're talking to people about it, hoping that elements of that will be adopted, and people maybe begin to adopt them to self-improve. So one of the big things back then, the argument over addiction, this leads directly to prohibition. That's, by the way, part of the corruption here that I'll explain in a moment. You get attempts at social reform. So the temperance movement. Now, look at the difference, temperance, prohibition. We're talking about in the U.S. sense. This illustrates the point perfectly. The temperance movement that already exists in the 19th century was very spiritual. The fire and brimstone ministers and the occultists all fucking agreed on the basic premise: all these people are drunk, they're killing themselves with alcohol, they're beating their wives, they're not tithing enough in the case of the ministers, very important. We need to do something about this. The temperance movement forms. The temperance movement at first is fundamentally a voluntaristic suggestion to people: hey, here's a tract that'll teach you why the Lord doesn't want you to drink. Here's a tract that teaches you that you can develop psychic powers, but you have to put the booze down. Nobody was being compelled to. They were just being encouraged to for their own good. Then people got the bright idea of using prohibition. And because politicians made a lot of money working with bootlegging groups, it persisted for a while. And then, of course, you get the regulatory system as the thesis, antithesis, synthesis goes on. It's very, very interesting. Prohibition goes away, but then all of a sudden now you have interventionism. And that's what they're moving towards. They don't want a fully controlled system because it's destabilizing and untenable. They want an intervened-in system. This is why China has adapted more of a Western-style facade to its economy, and why Western countries are becoming more like China. They're becoming the same corrupted amalgamation that ultimately is based on social reform. So the idea, for instance, the drug war. At first you have the thesis, which is we're going to do nothing, drugs, who cares. The antithesis, the dipole to that, is ban the drugs. After banning the drugs inevitably doesn't work, you end up with a synthesis system, which is interventionism. This is what you're getting with marijuana legalization in the U.S. Taxes, regulations, sometimes burdensome, how much you can grow, what kinds you can grow, where you can smoke, how old you have to be to smoke, taxes on the dispensary, taxes on the weed grower. You have to get a license to grow. Behold what has happened. The initial thesis was just, hey, it's a plant, fucking smoke it if you want to and leave other people alone. But we've ended up with a corrupted system which makes a lot of money. That's what it's about. These people are corrupted. However, they are pseudo-occultists. The kinds of reform systems that they hijacked in order to create that pseudo-centrality were occult in nature at first. I don't think, what I'm arguing is not that George Soros and the Bushes and Clinton and stuff, I'm not arguing that they understand the occult. I'm arguing that the systems which they have corrupted and hijacked were initially meant to be good and set up by people that had a spiritual motive behind it. Vegetarianism is a great idea. You have the thesis, which is eat what you want, meat's great. The antithesis is basically, you have to be a vegan, think of the kangaroos and shit, and then the synthesis is, of course, we're going to lab grow meat. So we'll end up with a monopolistic system in which you have Microsoft beef patties and Walmart, hybrid burgers and shit like that, which inevitably won't be healthy for you. But the original thesis is just do what you want. The antithesis initially is a suggestion, hey, vegetarianism is spiritually uplifting, it is superior. We have, we talk to Hindus, we talk to Buddhist stuff, think of the animal suffering's bad, and go to the stockyard and see the slaughterhouse and stuff for yourself and how miserable and the screams and the blood and stuff, and pretty soon you won't want a steak anymore. Now, though, you've got people trying to ban meat, tax you on how much meat you eat, lab grow the meat, mandate eat the bugs and stuff. Don't you see how the same basic premise has been replicated over and over for 100 years now? All in the wake of social reform movements forming inevitably the basis for all of these concepts. The initial concept, single-family living. The initial antithesis to that, well, we can come together as spiritual collectives into communities, completely voluntaristic, not overseen by a state. In fact, it's semi-separatistic, like the original Christians were, to educate children. The Waldorf schools sort of follow a vague, similar model. Anthroposophy is a kickoff of theosophy in some ways. The new antithesis is no. Single-family living is inefficient stuff. Think of the environment. We need more mid-density housing. Eliminate single-family zoning. Literally what they're doing in California. You can expect that to happen, unfortunately, in communities and states around the country at this point. They're trying to build a second antithesis. And what will the synthesis be? Interventionism. Oh, yeah. Some single-family zones can remain, but we'll have some that they're not allowed to. Oh, goody, a patchwork model, which is considerably worse than the initial thesis, and certainly far worse than the initial antithesis, which is, for efficiency reasons, voluntaristic groups can associate with one another to form pseudo-communes if they want to. Not communist, but communal after a fashion, still operating semi within the same system, but you shouldn't be forcing people to do that. Well, the government notices that basic concept gains some dominance, and it says, how can we make money off of this? How can we use it to promulgate more power? Globalism, in virtually every facet, is essentially the corruption and denigration of very good initial ideas, and that were meant to reform a public that, a century ago, had a large number of issues going on. There was a lot of illiteracy. Literacy would have been like 30-40%, even in the more developed parts of the world. Disease, addiction, the denigration of health, especially through alcohol and tobacco products, which are still legal. They just happen to be licensed, and you have to show an ID. Oh, you have to give the government money to use them. Can't make your own alcohol, for the most part. You can grow your own tobacco, but if you start rolling it up, you might get a knock on the door, even if you're just smoking it yourself. You've got all of these new problems now that have been created out of the reformist movements that were initially occult. Occultists were the first people that thought these up. They basically, you get the early colonial period. I mean, the colonial period post-industrial. Yeah, steamships and ironclads and shit. It makes it a little bit easier to traverse the rivers when arrows are being shot at you. the Western world expands into Africa, South America. They start studying the Indian subcontinent because the British, of course, subjugate it, and they go in and people do studies. And they took back this spiritual knowledge and they said, hey, while West is best, white Christian civilization, there are some elements of these other cultures and stuff that we haven't thought of really, and we think that they're wise. And so you get these various movements that are partially social reform movements, not even just spiritual. Anthroposophy is basically half a social movement when you think about it. It's a little bit more to that than theosophy. Theosophy is a little bit more bent towards the spiritual side. But as far as the academic and sociological side goes, it was a reformist attempt. Hey, man is in this fallen state, we're going to reform things. And unlike the old spiritual systems that said, oh, well, man's in a fallen state, you need more belief in this God, the new one said, no, there's things we can do tangibly and physically to improve society. Unfortunately, doing that requires centrality. And centrality breeds corruption. And that corruption quickly denigrated these movements and has led to many of the problems that we have today. It's not because of occultism, though. It's because of people that didn't understand the actual spiritual context, the occult, hijacked them. This is why I'm a libertarian, because these centralized systems, no matter how well-meaning, no matter how wise they happen to be, no matter how wise the religion is, you're always going to get a bunch of mega churches or self-professed yogis and sages and shit making a lot of money peddling a corrupted version to people. You have this all the time in every world religion. Within politics, every social reform movement falls apart within a generation and eventually becomes nothing more than a money sponge. BLM, all of these groups. They say, well, we want racial justice, but all you do is take donations. Yeah, look at Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and people like that have made careers for decades at a time out of this basic premise. You take an initial thesis-antithesis situation, you whittle it around a little bit in order to grift a bit, and you shave a little off the top, making society just a little bit worse off in the process. That's about all. Peace out.